Okay, we're rolling.
All right, this is a home interview, Cohoes, New York. This is the 27th of June, 2007, approximately 9:30 a.m. Interviewers are Mike Russert and Wayne Clark. Could you give me your full name, date of birth, and place of birth, please?
Helen A. Vartigian, or Ann Vartigian. It's Vartigian. My date of birth was 7/6/41.
Okay.
And my place of birth was St. Mary's Hospital, Troy, New York.
All right. What was your educational background prior to entering service?
I had a bachelor's degree in school nurse teacher education from SUNY Plattsburgh.
Right. Obviously, you volunteered. Why did you decide to enlist, and why did you select the Army?
Well, I think there was a lot of stuff on the news and in the newspapers, but as I've told a lot of people, you know, I was part of the Kennedy era where he said it's not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. So friends of mine entered the Peace Corps, and some went down south to help Black Americans register to vote, and I joined the Army Nurse Corps. I joined in May 1966 and went to Fort Sam Houston, Texas for a 6-week orientation. And from there I went to Fitzsimmons Army Medical Center in Denver, Colorado.
How long were you there?
I was there from July of '66 through November '66. On Labor Day weekend, 1966, I volunteered to go to Vietnam.
Mm-hmm. Now, what did you do at Fitzsimmons?
I was a staff nurse on an orthopedic ward. Mm-hmm. And it was a 60-bed ward, and most of our patients were returnees from Vietnam, so needless to say we were very busy.
Mm-hmm. Now, you were commissioned as a second lieutenant at
No, a first lieutenant.
First lieutenant.
Because I had been out of school 3 years, and I had a bachelor's degree.
Mm-hmm.
So I came in as a first lieutenant instead of a second lieutenant.
What was the care like at Fitzsimmons?
I thought it was wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
We worked our fannies off, but those patients received beautiful care. Mm-hmm. And unlike today, when some of them had to keep coming back for additional operations we, if they were able to, we had these back buildings, so that the patients could come and keep clinic appointments and all of that sort of stuff. And they were staffed, with maybe 1 or 2 people, because these patients, for the most part, were ambulatory. And even though they were Quonset-type buildings, they were in excellent shape. Mm-hmm. And we were able to monitor these patients. They were not caught between the cracks. They weren't released from the Army quickly. They stayed in a military setting until basically they could function on their own, and most of the work was completed.
Okay. Now, why did you decide to volunteer to go to Vietnam?
Because it was the thing to do, and it was something I wanted to do.
Did any of your friends volunteer to go at the same time? People you worked with?
There were a couple of people I worked with that went with me to Vietnam. We left a few days after Thanksgiving, 1966. In San Francisco, I got in the day before and met a friend who was stationed at Fort Ord, which is on the Monterey Peninsula, and I stayed overnight at her house, and we had to report the next day at San Francisco International Airport. Then I met two people I know from Fitzsimmons. And what it turned out, I was assigned to the 12th Evac, and this was a new hospital. By new, I don't mean that the 12th was used in Korea and in World War II, but it hadn't been to Vietnam yet. So when we got there, there were about 30 of us on that plane that we didn't know one another except for the three of us. But anyway, when we got there, the hospital wasn't open yet. The 7th surge was open, smaller hospital, but it closed down after we got started. We were in a 300-bed hospital.
Now, this was a new facility.
Right. It was Quonset buildings. And it had the capability of holding 300 patients. But when we first got there, there were things that weren't completed. And so we spent the time painting the wards or getting shelving put in for supplies, getting supplies for the wards. So our hospital officially opened, I think, Christmas Day, 1966. Things were quiet for the most part until the first part of January 1966. And then we had our first mass casualty of probably 200 patients or more, because we were in the base camp of the 25th Infantry Division. So, and we supported the 25th Infantry Division medically. We came under I think it was the 44th Medical Brigade, which all the hospitals in Vietnam came under. So, during this mass casualty, the OR staff worked about 72 hours, and the rest of us worked 12 to 16 hours. But everybody ran to the emergency room, which wasn't a good idea. And the doctors tried to save everyone, so we didn't have a true triage that first time. And as I said, we tried to save everyone, so nobody was placed in the expectant category. By expectant, meaning they were going to die and all they needed was medication to keep them pain-free and maybe somebody to be with them. But instead we did try and save everyone. There were, to the best of my knowledge, while I was there were 3 campaigns, and I don't know which one came first that we supported, and it was Operation Cedar Falls, Operation Junction City, and Operation Manhattan. And this was probably from fighting outside our perimeter. There was no such thing as a front line. Now, according to World War II in Korea, where there were front lines, Vietnam was different. In World War II in Korea, the hospitals closest to the front line were surgical hospitals. They held a smaller number of people, and then they were sent to an evacuation hospital. But because there was no front line, and because the helicopter was available, we got them for the most part directly from the field. So we called ourselves, even though we were an evacuation hospital, we called ourselves a surgical super surge hospital, because I would say 90-95% came directly from the field.
Can I ask how many were there in your unit in this hospital?
When we first started, I would say, nurse-wise, there were probably about 30. Corpsmen, I guess I want to say maybe around 90, and I'm not sure how many physicians there were. Maybe 10 or 12 initially.
Okay. Now, what was the equipment like? I know you mentioned here in the form something about a lot of it was early on was World War II equipment.
Right. We had things like glass syringes. We had no intercaths.
What do you mean by that?
It's a type of needle in which there's a piece of plastic that slides through the needle. Then you remove the needle. It was for IV therapy. And it allowed you to keep the IV in place without having to change it for a couple of days. Or it also lessened the chance of it coming out of the vein, too, primarily. And the people that had the equipment for the 60s, disposable needles and syringes, were with the 25th Infantry Division, their battalion aid stations had all this 60 type of equipment. So we would try and barter with them to get it. Also, if someone went on R&R someplace where there was a military hospital, they would take a empty suitcase with them and bring back as much as they could. We had no colostomy bags and no chest bottles for drainage from chest tubes. So we used IV glass bottles for just tube drainage. And each of the plastic IV tubing boxes was covered with a piece of plastic, so we would cut one end and take out the box, and then we'd make slits on 4 sides of that bag, and that's what we used for colostomy bags. So we had to improvise. We had no hot water, except when the sun hit the hot water tank. And so when we gave bed baths, I had a Bunsen burner on my ward, and so I'd fill one container full of water and heat that water, and then pour some of the water in each of the other basins, and then add some regular water so that the water that the patients received would be tepid rather than cold. So, and that's how we gave the bed baths.
Do you know if the other hospitals were experiencing shortages of equipment too?
I don't know
Uh-huh.
for sure. I'm sure they were.
Mm-hmm.
Probably the 3rd Field Hospital was probably the most sophisticated one. It was in regular buildings, and so I think the nurses there wore white uniforms, if I'm not mistaken.
Now, what kind of uniforms did you wear?
Fatigues,
Fatigues.
just like this here. Yeah.
Well, since you showed us, when and where was this photograph taken?
That was taken Christmas Day, 1966. We only had about 7 patients in the hospital, and they were all ambulatory. And so we went over, that was the 9 of us who
Now,
lived
where are you in that photograph?
right here.
Okay, got it.
We all lived in Hooch number 3, and which was a wooden building with a tin roof. And we were getting ready to go over and see the Bob Hope show. And Donna was in civilian clothes because she was going to introduce Bob Hope. So that's that picture.
How was that Bob Hope show?
Excellent. Excellent. Very good. They had Phyllis Diller. They had Anita Bryant, Vic Damone. Let's see. I can't think of her name.
What?
They had the Korean Kittens. They had Miss Universe.
You didn't have Connie Stevens with him.
No, Anita Bryant was there.
Okay.
Was there. So, we saw many people that year we were there. They came to visit. We saw James Garner, Charlton Heston, Martha Ray, Miss America, Jonathan Winters, Hank Williams Jr. So they all came and some of them just came and walked through the wards, and others put on a, Dale Robertson came. Some of them just came and walked through the wards, and others put on a show. And that was, throughout the entire year we were there.
Did you have movies at night, or?
Yes, we did. Most of them were westerns. And one of my good friends who lives in Idaho, Connie Evans. Connie is right here. Connie is a full-blooded Nez Perce from Idaho. And so we used to go to the movies and cheer for the Native Americans. And then if Connie went to the movies by herself, when she came back, we'd say, "How was the movie, Connie?" And she'd say, "We lost again." So I've been out to Connie's 3 times in the past 13 years or so. She's been to my house a couple of times. Her husband was a professor of history. He's retired at Lewis and Clark College. And so now they're both retired. She retired from the United States Public Health Corps. She worked on the reservation doing Indian health. And so now that they're both retired, they make teepees. They're genuine, only they use canvas instead of leather. They have some Native American friends and relatives that also, if the person wanted to, they could have it painted with some sort of Native American painting. And 2 years ago, when I was out there in 2005, I went to a powwow with them in Oregon, Wallala, Oregon. And Connie made me an honorary sister and presented me with a beautiful Native American blanket.
Now, were you ever was your hospital ever under fire?
Yes, and I think probably we were mortared anywhere between 6 and 10 times while I was there. The first time we were mortared, I was working on the ward. It was about 7 o'clock at night, and the date was the 15th of March, 1967. And we didn't have any injuries at all. See, initially we were across from a artillery unit, and we were pretty close to an ammo dump. So Chu Chi wasn't the safest place in the world, and I learned 20 years later about the tunnels. And so the Vietnamese women that worked in our compound were not allowed to work in our hooches. In many of the hospitals, the Vietnamese women, clean the hooch, polish shoes, things like that. But we couldn't have that done, because lots of times they would work for us during the daytime and then work for the VC at nighttime. And I think that was primarily because they were afraid of the VC, and they didn't want their families suffering because by refusing to work. The types of wounds that we saw mainly were multiple fragment wounds, amputations, chest wounds, abdominal wounds. If we had head wounds, we transferred them down to 3rd Field Hospital in Saigon because they had neurologists and neurosurgeons there. We also had burns, and they stemmed basically from phosphorus grenades. The armored personnel carriers, or the APCs as they were called, were very light types of tanks, but inside the tank they carried phosphorus grenades. I believe they were used to light up the area, I'm not sure. But what happens is if the armored personnel carrier went over a mine, those grenades would explode and give terrible, terrible burns. It made the people, their faces look like cartoon caricatures. They were distorted and huge. The face had, seemed to like blow up. And that may have been like from the fluid. So they were treated and transferred out as quickly as possible. The burn hospital was the one in Japan, so they were sent there as quickly as possible. Our worst enemy at that time was a bug called Pseudomonas, and because we didn't have the sophisticated antibiotics that we have today, this bug could get in there and, if allowed to grow, it could kill the person. So we did not, and today in Iraq too, for the most part, with fragment wounds and things of this sort, they did something called delayed primary closures. They would clean up the wound as best as possible, but not sew it back together until they were assured that all the infection would go away. Had been gone. And they treated them with, for the most part, with antibiotics, of course, and wet to dry dressings. And you put on a dressing and put saline on it, and then it would dry, and then you would have to take it off. So we gave them pain medication before we did this, because when you took it off, it was painful, but the purpose was to get the pus and everything out of there. These were usually done anywhere from 2 to 4 times a day. I was head nurse of the orthopedic ward, so a lot of my patients had fragment wounds in addition to fractures, etc. Their usual medication, unless they were allergic, was they received an IV dextrose in water with 12 million units of aqueous penicillin, and they received that twice a day, because each IV was supposed to last about 12 hours.
Now, how long were you there?
I was there a year, from
What-
November 66 through November 67.
All right. What changes did you see take place in medical care while you were there?
Well, we were able to get some modern
Mm-hmm.
equipment. We had some excellent surgeons. One in particular, his name was Shannon Turney, and I believe he was from Tennessee. I think he had completed his internship and maybe beginning of his residency, but I knew he wanted to be a thoracic surgeon. Had a very thick southern accent, so it was hard to understand him initially until you got used to it. But we all used to say we were going to get wristbands that in case something happened to me and I was unconscious, that I wanted Shannon Turney to operate. That's how highly. And he did become a thoracic surgeon. Let's see.
Now, I know you were an officer for the most part. What were officers like in your unit?
Well, the medical organization, medical people weren't necessarily the most strapped people you'd want to meet. Most of the doctors and nurses were on first name basis. We did have a few regular Army people who tried to make us strack, but it was a lost cause. They did have some ridiculous things. After, we worked 12-hour shifts. So after the guy from Medical Brigade came up and wanted to beautify Chu Chi, and the only thing that would beautify Chu Chi would have been the atomic bomb. But he wanted the corpsmen to plant flowers and grass around the hooches. So after working 12 or 14 hours, then they had to plant flowers, which we thought was ridiculous. The IG, Inspector General, thing that takes place everywhere in the Army once a year, they were so scared of the IG that the corpsmen were made to take the dirty laundry over to their hooches. There could be no dirty laundry on the ward in the dirty laundry basket, which is where it was supposed to be. Okay. So they had to bring it over to their hooches. So things like that, Mickey Mouse stuff.
Now, over the course of the year that you were there, was there one time that you got more casualties than?
Well,
did it progress?
Basically, during the entire year, we had what was called 3 mass casualties. Not that we weren't busy the other time, but this was when so many came in that the people who worked in the OR had to work 72 hours. We were open the first year that we were open, which was when I was there. We had 8,000 admissions.
Oh my God.
We were open from 1966 through 1970. And during that time period, we received 38,000 patients. So we were busy.
Mm-hmm. Now, did you have problems there with people coming down with tropical diseases, malaria,
Yes,
etc.?
we had one medical physician and we had one medical ward. And most of our patients were either malaria or dengue fever,
Mm-hmm.
upper respiratory infections. We did have one patient who went to his sick call with his unit complaining of chest pain, and everybody thought he was shamming. What's the word?
Ghosting? Shamming's good.
Okay. So by the time they brought him to our hospital, he had advanced pericarditis, which is an inflammation or an infection of the pericardium around the lining that surrounds the heart. And there was nothing the doctor could do to save his life. Let's see. We also took care of Vietnamese patients, and there was one Vietnamese ward, and we took care of prisoners of war too.
Mm-hmm.
One time we took care of a couple of Korean patients. Okay. When on the Vietnamese ward in particular, was difficult because when a patient came in the hospital, the family believed that meant that the patient was going to die. That was their belief. So the whole family decided to move in, and it made it difficult for the caretakers. Another thing that, I know, to get back to being mortared, the last time while I was there that we were mortared was about 5 days before we left Vietnam. And it was about 7 o'clock at night, and those of us in the hooch went into the bunker. But the patients, a lot of the patients were watching the movie. And there were these two medical patients. Now their ward was about 200 yards from where the movie was being shown. And instead of hitting the ground somewhere near, they decided to run back to their ward. And about just outside their ward, they were hit with an airburst. So one was killed and the other one had a severe chest injury. The two nurses on the medical ward, when they saw what happened, and ran out and administered first aid to the two patients. And they were awarded, I think, an Army Commendation Medal with V device for that, I think. Yeah. Another time we were mortared, we were inside our hooches. Well, some of us were. The others were working. And the door jammed, so we couldn't get into the bunkers. So the major in the in charge in Arhuj told us to get under our cots, which was probably the scariest because when you're in the bunker, you're with everybody. You can touch one another, etc. But when you're underneath your own bed, even though your neighbor might be 5 feet away because straw walls or bamboo walls separate.
Okay.
Now, at your end of your time in Vietnam, you were in until 1980. What did you do?
Okay, my other assignments included, well, I went back to Fitzsimmons Army Medical Center. And I said I had about 6 months left in the initial tour. I got back there in January and it would have been up in May. I said I would go indefinite if I could get Europe. And I went indefinite and I was assigned to Shape, Belgium. So I spent 2 years in Europe. I wound up spending a year in Holland, and it was called AFCENT, Allied Forces Central Europe, and it was in Brunsum, Holland. And because under the Shape chief nurse was this dispensary, and they were short a nurse, and because I was the newest one there, I was sent up there. And there were 2 of us there, 2 nurses, my boss who was a major and I was a captain. And then after a year we had to cut back on the dispensary, and so I was sent back to the hospital in Mons, Belgium. And there I was an assistant head nurse of a multi-service ward, meaning we took care of psych patients, pediatrics, medicine, surgical, and the most we could hold would be, I think, 20 patients. It wasn't that big. The inpatient department was staffed by United States military. The outpatient was staffed by the members of the various NATO nations. I took care of English patients, German patients, Dutch soldiers, all NATO, Turkish patients, Canadians, that sort of, and it was a super experience. So I spent 2 years there, and when I finished there, I put in to go regular Army, and then I went to the career course at Fort Sam Houston, Texas. And spent 6 months there, completed the course, and that was from July 70 through December 70. Then I was assigned to Valley Forge General Hospital in Phoenixville, Pennsylvania. And there I worked on the intensive care unit. And then I had my own ward, which was urology and plastic surgery. And I was there from January 1971 through June of 1972. And from there, I went to graduate school. The Army sent me to graduate school. And I went to Russell Sage College, where I received a master's degree in nursing. I left there eventually to go to Fort Ord, California, on the Monterey Peninsula, where I was to be the director of the Army's Adult Nurse Practitioner Program. And that too was learning experience, because my master's degree was at a functional minor in education and a major in medical surgical nursing. So I had to learn what a nurse practitioner was. I had to learn the skills of the nurse practitioner. So for the first couple of courses, and they were 6 months in length, I felt like I was 5 steps ahead of the students. And I was also at the same time an adjunct faculty member at the University of Texas, San Antonio. My students were Army Nurse Corps officers who had a bachelor's degree in nursing, and the course they took from me granted them 12 to 16 graduate credits, which they then at a later date could go on to the University of Texas in San Antonio and complete their master's degree. The graduates in the Adult Nurse Practitioner program focused on adults who were chronically ill, diabetes, hypertension, high blood pressure, thyroid problems, coronary problems, or problems of the heart. We also did some acute care, like colds, ear infections, but the primary focus was on chronically ill patients, maintaining them. We managed their medications under given protocols. We worked with physician preceptors, and so we considered, and for the most part we had a collegial relationship with the physicians that we worked with. Usually the physicians and the nurse practitioners even ate lunch together, you know, and so I was very proud of what they had, from where they were when they started out and what they evolved into. And that was probably one of the most rewarding experiences. During that time period, I was promoted to major in 1975. After the 4 years, I wanted a change. I wanted to try administration, but I wanted to stay nearby. But Washington decided they were going to send me to Europe. And that was the beginning of my demise. I had a small hospital. I was the assistant chief nurse of a small hospital in Bremerhaven, Germany. And my chief nurse and I had an interpersonal conflict, and I went into a depression, and but I wound up being passed over for promotion to regular Army major, so I had to get out. It was an honorable discharge, but and I tried to fight it, but I guess I didn't. I wrote up something, but I didn't have the strength to fight it. So, and we were isolated for the most part. So I got in the reserves, but when I got here, they said I was overweight. So I was also again depressed, so I really didn't try and do anything about it. So for the additional 6.5 years, because I spent 14.5 years on active duty, I was in the inactive reserves, and I only earned about 15 units a year for just being in the reserves. So in 1997, I received my discharge was Major Retired Reserve.
Now, are you eligible for a pension at age 60 or?
No, I'm 65 now, but I am also 100% disabled through the VA. Part of it is for psych, and my counselors called it PTSD, but I guess in the VA they call it a type of depression. I then found out that in 1998 or so, I had a heart attack, and I was diagnosed with diabetes in 1991, and I was put on oral medication. Now, somewhere down that road, the VA came out with Agent Orange causing type 2 diabetes. I think it was around the same time I had the heart attack. And so because I was on insulin after I had the heart attack, I got 40% for the diabetes. But they didn't feel the heart attack applied. Now, this was 98 or 99. So I continued working. At that time, I was working with the state of New York. I was hired in 1993 in the New York State Department of Health. So I kept working, and at the age of 62, I retired, and at that time I had an 80% disability with the VA. Well, then my counselor said, we need to put you in for 100% disability. Well, what happened is I got a letter from my primary physician, and the VA never sent that in to the board. So when they did send it in, it came through as approved. I think it was 90% total disability, which is really, I get the same pay as 100% disability, and I get the same benefits. So I never applied for disability through Social Security.
Mm-hmm.
So I, you know. So now I'll be retired 4 years in June. And the vet center really helped me, you know, with my depression and so.
How do you think your time in the service had an effect on your life?
Well, I love the Army Nurse Corps. And I wish it had turned out better. I see my friends who have all either made it to colonel or lieutenant colonel. My true friends don't hold it against me. I have a lot of friends that are retired full colonels.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, thank you very much for your interview.
You're welcome.